The year is 1945. The once dominant Japanese presence in the Pacific is fading, and Allied forces are relentlessly pushing forward across the theatre. For 2 years, Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy has steadily brought American troops closer to the Japanese mainland. Only islands of critical strategic importance are being seized, with all others bypassed. In November 1943, the US took Tarawa, followed by the Marshall Islands in February 1944 and the Marianas in June. The brutal landings at Peleliu in September 1944 offered a stark preview of just how costly these island battles could become. US commanders set their sights on the tiny island of Iwo Jima as the next objective. Measuring only 4.5 miles long and between 0.5 to 2.5 miles wide, it was an insignificant speck in the vast Pacific. However, its location, halfway between Tokyo and US air bases in the Marianas, made Iwo Jima a vital potential support base for B-29 bombers, escort fighters, and search and rescue craft. Crucially, Iwo Jima was also part of the Tokyo prefecture, considered sovereign Japanese soil. Its capture, the Americans hoped, would deliver a severe psychological blow to Japan. The US Marine Corps' 5 amphibious corps, comprising the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, was assigned the monumental task of capturing the island, codenamed Operation Detachment. In total, 100,000 men and 700 ships would participate in a battle the Americans expected to conclude in 5 to 10 days. Defending Iwo Jima were 21,000 Japanese troops of the 109th Infantry Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Having meticulously studied the Battle of Peleliu, Kuribayashi devised a different strategy. Instead of engaging the Marines on the beaches or relying on costly banzai attacks, he planned to let them come ashore and then grind them down in a war of attrition within 2 primary defensive belts. These belts consisted of hundreds of caves, tunnels, and expertly hidden pillboxes, which the Japanese were ordered to hold to the last man. Kuribayashi's courageous battle vows instructed each of his soldiers to kill 10 invaders. The preliminary bombardment of Iwo Jima began 3 days before D-Day, February 19th. This was significantly less than the 10 days Major General Harry Schmidt, commander of the 5 amphibious corps, had requested. As the 1st Marines moved onto the 6 landing beaches at 9 a.m., Japanese resistance initially appeared light. The most immediate obstacle was a 15-foot-high terrace of volcanic ash, which hampered the men and prevented their supporting LVTs from moving inland. Just as bulldozers were brought in to clear a path, Kuribayashi unleashed his artillery. Pre-sighted to bracket the landing beaches, it pounded the Marines, inflicting heavy casualties. Then, Japanese machine guns opened fire from Mount Suribachi, a semi-active volcano and the island's highest point. But the heaviest Japanese fire of all came from the quarry on the extreme right of the landing beaches. Even before the invasion, Major General Clifton Cates, commander of the 4th U.S. Division, had expressed his concern. "You know, if I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad, of the right-hand company, of the right-hand battalion, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in." By 11 a.m., bulldozers had cleared a path from the beaches, and the Marines began to threaten Airfield No. 1. Meanwhile, the 28th Marine Regiment moved to cut off Mount Suribachi, establishing a tenuous blockade. Colonel Harry Liversedge reported on the conditions. Troops ashore and moving to isolate volcano. Resistance moderate, but terrain awful. By early afternoon, the fighting subsided, but by the end of D-Day, only a third of the first day's objectives had been taken. On February 20th, D+1, the Marines captured Airfield No. 1, but elsewhere, Japanese resistance was clearly stiffening. In the east, Marines relentlessly pushed against the quarry, while the 28th moved around the base of Suribachi and its 70 reinforced concrete emplacements. Kuribayashi tried to bolster his men's resolve. Each man should think of his defense position as his graveyard, fight until the last, and inflict much damage to the enemy. February 21st, D+2, brought a new adversary for the Americans, the weather. Rain and wind shut down the beaches, while kamikazes attacked US naval vessels offshore, sinking an escort carrier. On the island, the bloody fighting continued. In the west, the flatter terrain allowed for the use of tanks, and the Americans made better progress, but against the quarry, US casualties mounted. One company of 240 Marines was reduced to just 18 men fit for duty. Approximately 5,300 Marines had been killed or wounded in the first 3 days, so the reserve, the 3rd Marines, was sent in ahead of schedule. Things did not improve on February 22nd, D+3, as the rain turned Iwo Jima's volcanic sand into a sticky goo that clung to boots and fouled weapons. The 28th Marines reported, "Bad weather and poor visibility throughout the day hampered our operations considerably. The rain mixed with volcanic dust caused stoppages in practically all automatic weapons, reducing them to single shot." Nonetheless, the Marines pressed on. The 28th now began to scale Suribachi, while elsewhere the Marines attacked Kuribayashi's main defensive belt. Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into a complex network of interconnected and mutually supporting hardpoints of all shapes and sizes. Some were simple snipers' nests made from natural cracks in the rocks, while others were large reinforced blockhouses that seemed impervious to even heavy artillery. The larger bunkers were well stocked with supplies and facilities. Japanese soldier Tsuji Akikusa recalled, "The Southern Islands Naval Air Station Headquarters bunker was the largest bunker on the island, and it was rumored that it would be able to hold out for about 3 months. There were about 800 people in the bunker. There were no fewer than 500 drums filled with heavy oil, light oil, gasoline, and drinking water. With the aid of tunnels, Japanese soldiers could move around the battlefield undetected and launch their feared night attacks, which increased in frequency with each passing day. As a result, after dark, American forces fired illumination shells to constantly bathe the island in light. The tunnels also allowed the 800-man Japanese garrison at Suribachi to withdraw to the north just as the 28th began its final assault on February 23rd. After meeting light resistance on the summit, Marines raised 2 US flags on the mountain to signal its capture, and in doing so, they created one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. But the capture of Suribachi did not mean the US had won the battle. The next day, February 24th, US forces assaulted Airfield No. 2, but Japanese mines and anti-tank guns prevented the use of tanks. So, it was up to American infantrymen, armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and small arms to lead the assault. The Japanese stubbornly held on at the north end, and US troops were only able to make serious advances in the west. Although the 4th Marines cleared the quarry in the east, they now clashed against the toughest enemy position yet. On February 25th, D+6, the Marines in the east entered the Meatgrinder, a complex of Japanese defenses centered on 3 locations: Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and a low basin known as the Amphitheater. Defenders in these positions could mutually support each other with machine guns, artillery, and dug-in tanks. American progress slowed, with advances measured in 100-yard dashes, which the men called touchdowns. Over the next 2 days, February 26th and 27th, D+7 to D+8, the 4th Marines continued to struggle with the Meatgrinder, while the other divisions also came up against their own hardpoints. On February 27th, the Americans consolidated their gains, but progress northwards was still being measured in touchdowns. The Japanese were stubbornly defending their positions, which often held until US armor assaulted them from point-blank range, sometimes with Zippo Sherman flame-throwing tanks. American tankers also rammed or churned their treads over cave entrances to collapse them. Japanese soldier Okoshi Harunori recalled his fears. Even if you pretended to die and fell over, on level ground, American trucks and tanks would drive over you. Some of the soldiers hid in foxholes to avoid being run over, but when the American tanks found a foxhole, they would roll around on top of it and crush the people inside. If they got you like that, you were doomed to gurgle until you died. On February 28th, D+9, which US command originally expected to be the last day of the battle, victory still seemed a distant prospect. With the East becoming a stalemate, Schmidt ordered the 3rd Division to push in the center towards the coast to split the Japanese defenders' last belt. With the aid of a massive artillery and air bombardment, the Marines surged forward and seized the remains of Airfield No. 2. By the next day, March 1st, D+10, American forces were threatening the unfinished Airfield No. 3, while in the west, the 5th Marines now clashed against Nishi Ridge, another prepared defensive position. In the east, Hill 382 was partially captured, but the Japanese on Turkey Knob and Amphitheater continued to hold out. As American casualties and exhaustion mounted, more and more NCOs took command of Marine units. In some cases, privates led their units in assaults. But just as US forces were making progress in the east, on March 2nd, D+11, the central drive bogged down. Japanese defenders on Hills 362B and C were holding up the Marines, with the summits heavily contested in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. By the following day, March 3rd, D+12, a stalemate set in. Marine casualties had been extremely high so far, 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. The Japanese had lost 14,000, almost all dead, and only had about 7,000 men left. In the west, the Americans captured Nishi and Hill 362A and fully surrounded the amphitheater. As the battle continued, the Marines also began to note deceptive Japanese tactics. Snipers dressed in Marine uniforms and armed with M1s were encountered. Also, it was discovered that the enemy was booby-trapping their dead. In anticipation of future offensives, Schmidt now ordered 2 days of rest, March 4th and 5th, D+13 to D+14, except for smaller attacks to straighten the line. Fresh American replacements arrived, but many of them had no combat experience. Airfield No. 1 saw some unusual activity today, as damaged B-29 bomber Dynamite made an emergency landing. The next day's American attack, March 6th, D+15, was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment. The guns fired over 22,500 shells in the first hour alone. However, their impact and the advance in general was disappointing from the US point of view. Fierce Japanese resistance limited the Marines to advances of only 50 to 100 meters across the whole island. It became clear that the Japanese were now well versed in the method and schedule of Marine attacks, an artillery barrage followed by infantry assault. So on March 7th, D+16, 3rd Division's General Graves Erskine suggested a dawn attack at 5 a.m. without artillery. Graves' troops wouldn't advance straight ahead as previously, but into a Japanese sector facing the neighboring 4th Division. The Americans tried the new method for the first time, and it seemed to work, as by the end of the day they took Hill 362C. This advance started to create a pocket of Japanese resistance known as Cushman's Pocket, which continued to hold out. At midnight of the same day, senior Japanese commander Captain Samaji Inoue ignored Kuribayashi's orders and led a 1,500-man banzai attack from around Tachiiwa Point. He hoped to pierce the US lines, destroy equipment, and even scale Suribachi to raise the Japanese flag. But the Marines' fire decimated his men, some of whom were only armed with bamboo spears or explosive vests from range. The Americans suffered few losses. The wasteful Banzai charge on March 7th marked the end of major resistance in the east. Over the next 3 days, March 8th to 10th, D+17 to D+19, the Marines bypassed Japanese hardpoints in Cushman's Pocket and finally reduced the Meatgrinder. In the north, a US patrol reached the sea before the Japanese pushed it back. Kuribayashi knew the battle was coming to a close, but he radioed to Tokyo that he had no intention of surrendering. All surviving fighting units have sustained heavy losses. I am very sorry that I have let the enemy occupy one part of Japanese territory, but am taking comfort in giving him heavy damages. On March 11th, D+20, Japanese resistance only existed in 3 isolated pockets: Cushman's Pocket, the eastern coast, and part of the northwest coast. Kuribayashi now fell back to a gorge, later dubbed Bloody Gorge, with his last 1,500 men. The Marines were exhausted, and many were incapacitated by a psychological condition they called combat fatigue, today known as PTSD. So they called on the Japanese to surrender, announcing on loudspeakers that prisoners would be treated well, and suicidal resistance was senseless. The Americans also distributed a translated letter from Japanese prisoner of war Hideo Momoda. Comrades, I myself would never have believed that things could be this way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. At first, I was embarrassed to have been taken by the enemy, but when I learned that several officers had the same experience, I felt better. In our conversations, we agreed that it is more honorable to live for the emperor and work for a greater Japan in the future than merely to die like rats underground. Messages like that one, though, had little impact. The Americans continued to advance and eliminate all Japanese strongpoints except for Bloody Gorge. Although US authorities declared Iwo Jima secure on March 14th, Kuribayashi continued to hold out for 9 more days in a seemingly impregnable blockhouse. US artillery couldn't be used for fear of friendly fire, so Marines armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition explosives took on the job of reducing it. On March 23rd, Kuribayashi issued his final communication to the Japanese garrison on nearby Chichijima. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. Kuribayashi's ultimate fate is not known. It's possible that he committed suicide, or that he died in one of the Banzai attacks that became more common in the final days. On March 26th, around 200 to 300 Japanese troops snuck out of the Bloody Gorge and struck at Airfield No. 2, attacking mostly airmen and construction personnel. This charge, which US troops quickly destroyed, signaled the end of the battle. It was now D+35. Marine casualties were around 23,000, including 6,800 dead, while the Navy lost about 2,800 dead and wounded. 19,000 of the 21,000 Japanese troops on the island were killed. Only 216 surrendered during the battle, and up to 2,000 continued to struggle in small groups until they were mopped up by US troops. Although the later Battle of Okinawa would prove even costlier for the Americans, Iwo Jima remains the deadliest single battle for the Marines, and the only battle in the US Pacific campaign where American casualties outnumbered those of the Japanese. Iwo Jima is also a battle with a controversial legacy. The US Army and Navy would later claim the operation was of little use, especially for the price paid. But for its intended practical purposes, it did provide immediate benefits. Through the last months of the war, 2,251 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo, potentially saving the lives of 24,000 US airmen.